The ad had said temporary girlfriend, 3 days, cash on completion, no questions asked. Maya Whitfield needed exactly that kind of money, and exactly that little time to think about it. She hadn't expected the man behind the ad to be Han Doyun, a name every family in Seoul's underworld said carefully, like saying it too loud might summon him. She hadn't expected his grandfather, frail and sharp-eyed in a hospital bed, to take her hand on the very first visit and say, "Finally, I was starting to think he'd die alone too." She hadn't expected any of it to start feeling less like a performance by the second day. To the family, if you've ever taken a job you weren't sure about just because your back was against the wall, hit like right now and tell us in the comments. Because Maya's decision was about to change everything. Like and subscribe to keep our circle growing. 3 days earlier, Maya sat at her kitchen table with 2 envelopes in front of her. One was a late notice from her landlord. Red letters stamped across the top. Final warning before proceedings. The other was a tuition reminder from a university back home, addressed to her because her brother was 20 and still too proud to open his own mail when the numbers scared him. She had 2 jobs already. Mornings, she taught English to bored teenagers who scrolled their phones under the desk. Evenings, she taught tired businessmen who fell asleep mid-sentence after a 12-hour shift. Neither paycheck stretched far enough to cover both envelopes at once, and she'd already done the math 4 times hoping it would come out different. She found the ad on a bulletin board app expats used to trade apartments and furniture, buried between a used bicycle and a lost cat. 3 lines long. Temporary girlfriend needed for family visit. 3 days. Generous compensation. No romantic obligation, professionalism required. She almost scrolled past it twice. The 3rd time, she wrote back before she could talk herself out of it, fingers moving faster than her better judgment could keep up with. The reply came within the hour, from an assistant who signed her messages Ms. Jung and spoke in clipped, efficient English. She asked Maya to meet at a hotel lobby, not an apartment, which felt like the first sign this might actually be safe. Maya wore her one good blazer and arrived 10 minutes early, sat with her hands folded in her lap like she was interviewing for a teaching post instead of whatever this actually was. Ms. Jung slid a folder across the table without preamble. Inside was a contract, a sum of money that made Maya's hands go still, and a single photograph of a man she recognized immediately, because you didn't live in Seoul for 3 years without learning which names you didn't say too loudly in certain neighborhoods. Han Doyun. Ms. Jung didn't call him a gangster. She called him the head of a family business, which was its own kind of answer, delivered with a straight face that dared Maya to ask a follow-up question. She explained that his grandfather was dying, that the old man's last wish was to see his grandson settled before he passed, and that Doyun himself hadn't chosen this. The ad had been Ms. Jung's idea, offered in quiet desperation after watching a good man circle the drain of his own loneliness for years while everyone around him pretended not to notice. Maya asked if Doyun knew she was sitting here right now. "He does," Ms. Jung said. He didn't argue, which is the closest thing to enthusiasm I've seen from that man in a decade. Maya looked at the number again, looked at the 2 envelopes waiting for her back at the apartment. Though she couldn't see them from here, could feel them anyway, the way you feel a bruise before you touch it. "I'll need it in writing that this ends when it says it ends," Maya said. Ms. Jung almost smiled. "That's the smartest thing anyone said to me all week." Maya signed the contract with a hand that trembled only a little. She met him the next morning in the back of a car that smelled like cedar and old leather. Han Doyun was younger than she expected and colder in person than his photograph. All sharp tailoring and stillness, like a man who had trained himself out of unnecessary movement. He didn't smile when he looked at her. He studied her the way he might study an unfamiliar signature at the bottom of a contract, checking for a forgery. "You understand this ends in 3 days," he said. "And you understand my grandfather cannot know the truth." "I understand both," Maya said. He was quiet for a long moment, long enough that she started counting the trees passing the window just to have something to do with her eyes. Then he said, more to himself than to her, "He's not going to make this easy for either of us. He wants a real answer, not a performance. He spent his whole life reading people for a living. He'll know." "Then I'll have to be a good actress," Maya said. Doyun looked at her properly for the first time since she'd gotten in the car. Something flickered behind his eyes, gone before she could name it. He didn't say anything else for the rest of the drive. The estate sat outside the city, walled and quiet, the kind of place where every hedge looked like it had been trimmed by someone who feared consequences. Inside, the air smelled like medicine and old wood, competing scents that never quite settled into one another. Doyun's grandfather lay propped up in a bed that had been moved into what used to be a sitting room, because the stairs had become too much for him months ago. He was smaller than Maya expected, sharper too in the eyes, in a way that made her feel immediately, uncomfortably seen, like he'd already read the last page of whatever story she was about to tell him. He took her hand before Doyun had even finished the introduction. Finally, he said, "I was starting to think he'd die alone, too." Maya laughed before she could stop herself, a real laugh, startled out of her, and something in the old man's face eased at the sound of it like he'd been waiting to hear that exact thing for years. Doyun, standing a step behind her, went very still, the way a man goes still when something surprises him and he hasn't decided yet whether he minds. "Sit, sit," the old man said, patting the edge of the bed like she was an old friend running late. "Tell me everything about yourself. My grandson tells me nothing. I had to hire a private investigator just to learn his shoe size." "Grandfather," Doyun said, a warning in his voice that had no real weight behind it. "I'm an old dying man," the grandfather said, waving a hand at his own chest like it was a minor inconvenience rather than the reason for the entire household's quiet grief. "I'm allowed to embarrass you. It might be the last thing I get to do properly." "Don't say that," Doyun said, sharper than he meant to. "It's true whether I say it or not," the old man said, not unkindly. "Better I say it and we all get used to the sound of it than we pretend around each other for months. Now, girl, sit." Maya sat. Doyun hovered by the door for a long moment, like a man deciding whether to intervene in a negotiation he'd already lost before it started. And then he pulled a chair to the other side of the bed and sat too, arms crossed, watching his grandfather charm the truth out of a woman he'd met for the first time an hour earlier. 3 days, Doyun had told her in the car. But the grandfather refused to let the girl who finally made his grandson smile disappear so soon, and 3 days became an open stay, became a room down the hall from Doyun's, became breakfasts where the old man asked Maya questions about her life in a voice too tired to argue with but too sharp to fool. She told him about her brother, about teaching, about missing home in small unglamorous ways, like craving a diner breakfast that didn't exist anywhere in the city, real hash browns, coffee that tasted burnt in the specific way only American coffee managed. She didn't tell him about the envelopes on her kitchen table. Doyun watched these conversations from across the room with an expression she couldn't read. Arms crossed, jaw tight, like a man watching something happen in his own house that he didn't have a name for yet. One morning, the old man asked her, out of nowhere, whether she thought his grandson was a good man. Maya hesitated. "I think he's a man who's forgotten how to let people find out," she said finally. The old man looked at her for a long moment and then laughed. A wheezing, delighted sound that turned into a cough he waved off before anyone could fuss over him. "That's the first honest thing anyone in this house has said to me in months," he said. "Even the truthful ones lie to me now. They think I'm too fragile for it." Not everyone in that house was glad to see her. Doyun's cousin Tae-sik arrived on the second day with his wife and a smile that didn't move past his teeth. Tae-sik had spent years building a careful case to the family council that he, not Doyun, was the more suitable heir. Married, composed, photographed at the right charity dinners with the right expression arranged just so. His entire argument rested on one foundation: that Doyun was a cold, unmarriageable recluse who could never lead a real family, only an organization. Maya's presence in that house threatened to knock the foundation out from under him in a single afternoon, and he knew it before anyone had to explain it to him. He cornered her by the tea service on his first evening there, all warmth and teeth. "So," he said, pouring her a cup she hadn't asked for, "how exactly did you two meet?" Doyun's never been one for introductions. "We met through mutual friends," Maya said, the line she'd rehearsed in the mirror 3 times before coming downstairs. "Mutual friends," Tae-sik repeated, like he was turning the phrase over to check it for cracks. "Doyun doesn't have friends. He has employees who are afraid of him." "Then I suppose I'm the exception," Maya said, and smiled sweetly enough that Tae-sik had nothing left to do but smile back, though his eyes stayed cold the whole time. He started asking questions after that which sounded casual and weren't. Where was she from? Exactly. How long had she known his cousin? Where did she live? What did she do for money when she wasn't playing girlfriend to a dying man's grandson? When the answers didn't satisfy him, he did what men like Tae-sik always did. He looked for the crack. His wife, Ariam, was kinder about it, or at least quieter. She found Maya alone in the garden the second afternoon and sat beside her without asking permission, watching the koi pond for a while before speaking. "He's not a bad man," Ariam said eventually, of her own husband, in a tone that suggested she'd said the sentence to herself more than once before saying it to a stranger. "He's just spent 15 years being told he's the backup plan. That does something to a person." Maya didn't know what to say to that, so she just nodded. "Be careful," Ariam added, standing to leave. "Not because I think you're lying. Because I don't, and that's exactly the kind of thing that gets people hurt in this family." It didn't take Tae-sik long to find her landlord's number. A man Tae-sik paid made a phone call that frightened Maya's landlord badly enough that he called her in a panic, asking why strangers were asking about her finances, her eviction notice, whether she owed money to dangerous people, whether he needed to worry about his own safety for renting to her. Maya stood in the hallway of a mafia estate with her phone pressed to her ear, assuring a terrified 60-year-old man in broken Korean that everything was fine, that there had been some mistake, her hands shaking the entire time. She didn't tell Doyun. She didn't tell the grandfather. She absorbed it quietly, the way she'd learned to absorb most bad news, and kept showing up to breakfast with a steady voice and a full smile, because the contract hadn't said anything about bringing her problems into this house, and some stubborn part of her refused to be the reason any of this fell apart. Tae-sik took what he'd learned straight to the old man 2 days later, in a hallway, in a low voice meant to sound like concern. "The girl is being paid, grandfather," he said. "I only tell you because I love you, and I don't want you hurt again. Not after everything." The old man said nothing to that at the time. He only looked at Tae-sik for a long moment with an expression Tae-sik couldn't quite read, and then asked to be helped back to his room. But he remembered it. He remembered everything these days, in the specific hoarding way people remember things when they suspect they won't have much longer to make use of the memory. The days that followed had a fragile softness to them that Maya hadn't expected to feel and didn't know what to do with. Doyun started finding reasons to walk her through the garden after dinner, hands in his pockets, shoulders less rigid than they'd been the day she met him. He asked her questions the way a man asks questions when he's forgotten he's supposed to be performing indifference. What her classroom smelled like in the mornings, whether she missed snow, why she'd come to Seoul in the first place, and whether she regretted it some days. Some days, Maya admitted. Most days, no. He told her, once, quietly, under a maple tree that had started dropping the first orange leaves of the season, that his grandfather had raised him after his parents died in an accident he still didn't like to talk about, that the old man had never asked him for anything in return except this one thing, to see him settled, and that Doyun had spent years assuming he simply wasn't built for that kind of life. Too much blood on the ledger of who he'd had to become to protect this family, he said. Not the kind of man anyone builds a home around. She'd seen a version of that ledger herself 2 days earlier without meaning to. She'd walked into his study looking for a book the grandfather wanted and found him mid-conversation with two men she didn't recognize. His voice low and flat in a way she hadn't heard from him at the estate, the kind of voice that ended arguments before they started. He'd caught her eye across the room and something shifted in his expression instantly, the coldness dropping away so fast it startled her more than the coldness itself had. He'd apologized for the mess of it later that night, like he expected her to be frightened of him now that she'd seen the other half of his life. "I'm not frightened of you," she'd told him. "I'm frightened of how easily you believe I should be." He hadn't had an answer for that either. Maya didn't know what to say to that, so she said nothing and let the silence between them turn into something that wasn't uncomfortable anymore. Doyun looked at her sideways, like he was waiting for her to argue with him. And when she didn't, something in his face looked almost disappointed, though she couldn't have said why at the time. "You could argue with me," he said finally. "Most people do, eventually. It's usually a relief when they finally stop pretending they don't see what I am." "I'm not most people," Maya said. "And I don't think you're what you think you are either." He laughed, short and surprised, like the sound had escaped before he could stop it. "You don't know me well enough to say that. I know you sit with your grandfather every night even when he's asleep," Maya said. "I know the staff here are terrified of you and also would clearly walk into traffic for you if you asked. Those two things don't usually go together for the kind of man you're describing." He didn't have an answer for that. They walked the rest of the path in a silence that had stopped being about the job days ago, though neither of them said so out loud. She told herself it was the job. She told herself that every night, lying awake in a room too grand for her, less convincingly each time she said it. She thought sometimes, lying there, about the version of her life she'd have back home, ordinary and small and safe, and found she couldn't quite picture wanting it back the way she used to. The grandfather grew weaker as the days went on, his breathing thinner, his afternoons shorter, his naps stretching longer than either of them wanted to acknowledge out loud. On an evening when the whole family had gathered around his bed for what everyone quietly understood might be one of his last good nights, the room full of relatives speaking in hushed, careful voices, he took Maya's hand again in front of Taisik, in front of the aunts and cousins who had been watching her all week with narrowed, calculating eyes, and he asked her the question Taisik had been waiting for someone else to ask. "Do you love my grandson?" The room went still. Somewhere a clock ticked too loudly. Taisik's eyes found Maya's face and stayed there, waiting. Already halfway to a smile he wasn't bothering to hide anymore. Doyun stood at the foot of the bed, jaw tight, not looking at her, not looking away either. His whole body braced like a man waiting to hear a verdict he already suspected. Maya said yes. Came out smooth, practiced, exactly the way the contract had trained her to say it, because she had rehearsed some version of this exact question in the mirror the first night, terrified of a moment like this one arriving before she was ready. The old man's face relaxed into something like peace, his eyes closing briefly like a man setting down a weight he'd been carrying for years. Taisik's smile didn't quite land the way he wanted it to, the room having tilted somewhere he hadn't planned for. But Doyun heard the practiced ease in her voice, the same ease she'd have used to confirm a delivery address or a dinner reservation, and something in his chest went cold and still in a way he hadn't expected. He had spent a week telling himself this wasn't real, had built careful walls around the fact that he looked forward to their evening walks more than he looked forward to anything in years. Hearing her say it out loud so easily, so convincingly, was somehow worse than if she'd stumbled over the words. It confirmed the thing he'd been most afraid of, that she was simply very good at her job. He found her in the hallway that night, arms crossed, voice careful and formal, the voice of a man closing a business deal rather than ending whatever this had become. "The arrangement is over," he said. "Early. You'll be paid in full. No hard feelings." Maya opened her mouth to argue and then stopped, because what was there to say that wouldn't sound exactly like the lie he already believed her capable of? She didn't argue. She packed her bag before dawn and left the estate without saying goodbye to the old man, because she couldn't bear to lie to his face one more time. Not when the truth was finally something she wanted to say instead. She didn't go far. She told herself it was because the next flight home was expensive, not because some part of her refused to leave the city while that old man was still breathing, still asking after her, according to Ms. Jung, who called twice just to check that she'd landed somewhere safe. Maya took a room at a cheap guest house 10 minutes from the estate and waited for a phone call that didn't come. She spent those days the way she'd spent most of the hard days in her life, by keeping busy enough not to feel them properly. She picked up an extra shift at the evening academy. She called her landlord and paid off the balance in full, finally able to say the word eviction out loud without her voice shaking. She called her brother and told him tuition was handled too. Listened to him ask no follow-up questions the way 20-year-olds do when they've decided not to look too closely at good news. She didn't tell him about the estate, or the old man, or the way she caught herself checking her phone every few minutes despite herself. Ms. Jung called on the third night. Her clipped efficiency softened into something almost gentle. "He hasn't said your name once since you left," she said. "Which, for what it's worth, is the loudest thing I've ever heard him not say." "That doesn't mean anything," Maya said. "It means everything, actually," Ms. Jung said. "But I understand why you can't hear that right now." Maya didn't sleep well those nights. She kept thinking about the old man's hand around hers, the way he'd said finally like she'd answered a question he'd been asking the universe for years, and she hated that some part of her still wanted to walk back through those gates even after everything. The grandfather noticed her absence the very first morning, and asked after her twice before anyone worked up the nerve to answer him honestly. Doyun finally sat at his bedside and told him, simply, that the arrangement had run its course, that she'd gone back to her own life. It wasn't a lie exactly, just a smaller shape of the truth than the one Doyun himself was refusing to look at directly. The old man studied his grandson for a long moment, said nothing, and let it go outwardly, though the staff would later admit among themselves that he'd stopped finishing his meals that same week. Tae-sik saw it too, the old man's appetite thinning, the quiet grief nobody would name out loud, and understood exactly what it meant for his own plans. If his grandfather died still believing in Maya, still soft toward whatever she and Doyun had almost become, there was a real chance he'd use his final say to push the two of them back together instead of settling the family's future the way Tae-sik needed it settled. The breakup wasn't the end of the threat to him. It was a closing window. He needed the old man to stop believing in her for good, permanently, while there was still time left to make it matter, and he needed Doyun distracted and far from the house when he did it. Tae-sik, meanwhile, saw his opening and moved fast. He had the transaction records from Ms. Jung's office, proof that Maya had been paid, obtained through a contact he'd been cultivating for exactly this purpose, and he chose his moment with surgical precision, an afternoon when the old man was weakest and Doyun was 2 hours away, when a shock to the system might do more damage than any of them wanted to say out loud. He laid the papers on the old man's blanket himself, his voice soft and wounded, playing the reluctant messenger to the end. "I only show you because someone has to protect this family, grandfather. Even from itself." The old man's breathing turned ragged almost immediately. A nurse rushed in. Someone called for Doyun, who was handling business he now deeply regretted prioritizing over a feeling in his gut he should have listened to that morning. Tae-sik, to his credit or his shame, was the one already at the bedside when the household started to panic, positioning himself as the concerned grandson holding steady in the crisis he himself had caused, his hand resting on his grandfather's shoulder for anyone who might be watching. Maya heard about it from a call to Ms. Jung 20 minutes later, and she was in a taxi before the woman had finished the sentence, telling the driver to run every yellow light between the guest house and the estate gates. She arrived to a house in chaos, staff hovering uselessly in the hallway, an ambulance still 8 minutes out according to the last update, and Tae-sik standing over his grandfather's bed looking pale and important and entirely unhelpful. Maya didn't think. She pushed past him, checked the old man's pulse with hands that had steadied countless overtired students through anxiety attacks and knew exactly what panic did to a struggling heartbeat, and started doing the only thing she actually knew how to do. The thing 2 exhausting jobs and a first aid certificate from a community class years ago had taught her without her ever expecting to need it here, in a house like this, for a man like this. "Get me a cool cloth and prop that pillow higher," she said to the nearest staff member, her voice sharp and certain in a way that made people move without questioning her. She physically pulled Tae-sik back from the bed when he tried to hover in her way, told him flatly to either help or leave. "You don't belong in this house anymore." Tae-sik snapped at her. Even now, even with his own grandfather struggling for breath in front of him. "Then call security and have me removed after he's breathing normally," Maya said, without looking up from the old man's pulse. "Right now, get out of my light." Something in her voice left no room for argument, and Tae-sik, for the first time in this entire story, actually stepped back. She got the old man positioned and breathing steadier by the time Doyun burst through the door, still in his coat, face white in a way Maya had never seen on him. He took in the scene in half a second. His grandfather, breathing, color slowly returning. Tae-sik, shoved to the side, useless. Maya, kneeling on the floor beside the bed, steady hands, steady voice. The woman he'd sent away 3 nights ago holding his family together with her bare hands while everyone else had simply stood and watched. The ambulance arrived 4 minutes later. It was enough. To the family, sometimes the person we push away out of fear turns out to be exactly the one who comes back when it matters most. If you've ever misjudged someone you loved out of your own fear, tell us about it in the comments. We read every one of them. And hit like and subscribe if this story has you as invested as we are. We're almost at the end of Maya's story, and it's about to give you everything you've been waiting for. The old man recovered enough over the following days to sit up, to eat again, to hold court from his bed the way he always had, sharper than any of them expected after a scare that severe. When the family gathered once more, this time not in crisis but in the strange fragile relief that follows one, everyone crowded into the sitting room like it was a courtroom. He asked for Tae-sik first. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. A man who runs toward a dying stranger to save them owes nothing to anyone, he said, his eyes moving slowly around the room until they landed and stayed on his nephew. A man who weaponizes a deathbed for his own inheritance owes everything to his own shame. I have spent this past week learning which of my grandsons is which, and I am no longer confused about the answer. Tae-sik opened his mouth once, some defense half-formed, and then closed it again, because there was nothing left in the room willing to back him up. Not his wife. Not the aunts who had watched Maya work with their own eyes. Not even the staff who'd seen exactly who stayed and who postured. Ariam didn't defend him either, this time. She sat with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes on the floor, and later that week she would be the one to quietly tell the family council she wanted a separation. Though that part of the story belonged to her, not to Maya's, and nobody in that room needed to hear it today. Grandfather Tae-sik tried once weakly. I only wanted to protect this family. You wanted the family, the old man said. There's a difference, and I think you've always known it. Then the old man asked for Maya, and asked Doyun to come stand beside her, which he did without hesitation, crossing the room in 3 strides and taking her hand in front of everyone who had spent a week doubting her. Doyun said, quietly at first and then not quietly at all, the thing he'd stopped himself from saying since the night he sent her away. I told myself I ended it because I couldn't tell what was real, he said, his voice rough in a way none of them had heard from him before. That wasn't true. I ended it because I was afraid of finding out. Somewhere in 3 days that were supposed to be fake. All of it became real for me, and I was too much of a coward to say so until I watched you save the one person I couldn't survive losing. Maya didn't have a rehearsed answer for that one. She didn't need one. She said his name, just his name, and that was somehow enough for the whole room. The wedding happened 2 months later, in the same garden Doyun used to walk her through after dinner, string lights strung between the maple trees that had gone fully gold by then, with the old man seated in a chair near the front, a blanket over his knees despite the mild evening, breathing easier than he had in a year, exactly as he'd hoped he might live to see. Ms. Jung cried harder than anyone expected, insisting the whole time it was allergies. Taisik didn't come, and no one asked why. Maya's brother flew in for it, wide-eyed at the estate, at the security by the gate, at the sheer scale of a life his sister had somehow married into without ever mentioning it in their weekly calls. He hugged her before the ceremony and whispered, "So this is why you always dodged my questions about how you were affording rent?" And Maya laughed harder than she had in weeks. When it came time for vows, the old man asked, in a voice too weak to be denied and too amused to be entirely serious, whether he could go first. Doyun, laughing despite himself, said of course. "I have very little time left for speeches," the old man said, "so I'll be brief. I asked this girl once if she loved my grandson, and she told me yes in a voice so smooth I almost believed a lie. It took me a week to understand it wasn't a lie at all. It was just a woman terrified of losing something she'd only just found. I have watched a great many people pretend to love this family for what it could give them. I have never, in 80 years, watched anyone save one of us for nothing at all. That is the only kind of love I trust anymore, and I am glad I lived to see it standing in front of me." There wasn't a dry eye left in the garden by the time he finished, including, despite his best efforts, Doyun's. To the family, thank you for staying with Maya and Doyun's story all the way to the end. If it moved you even half as much as it moved us to tell it, let us know in the comments. Share it with someone who needs a little hope today, and like and subscribe so you never miss the next one. We'll see you in the comments.